listener production.
Hey, welcome to The Briefing. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Many of us have blocked from our minds the horror show that was the COVID pandemic. But no matter what state or territory you lived in, you would have been impacted by lockdowns or border closures or vaccine mandates. At the beginning, most of us felt pretty happy to follow the rules in order to flatten the curve and support our health system. But a new inquiry has found prolonged and restrictive lockdowns, ridiculous rules, a lack of government communication and consideration for our human rights eventually eroded our trust in government and politicians. So, almost 5 years on from the first detected COVID case in Australia, what other lessons have come out of this inquiry? And is public trust so damaged that it'll put us at risk come future health crises? Joining me now to talk about it is Adjunct Professor Terry Slevin. He's the CEO of Public Health Association of Australia. Thanks for joining us. Look, to start, could you give us a quick overview of what this inquiry has found when it comes to how we feel about the government in the wake of the COVID pandemic?
The report was very comprehensive across the entire experience of the COVID pandemic and went into a whole range of detail on a variety of issues, from quarantine to vaccine rollout and many other issues. And of course, one of the major challenges we all experienced with the pandemic was the loss of liberty. Government telling us where we could or couldn't go and when we could or couldn't go. All of those constraints, we all still feel in our guts. It's not just remember, it's left a scar on a lot of people. And really the inquiry heard from a lot of people who expressed frustration that they felt some of those constraints and restrictions in retrospect were too harsh, might not have been necessary, caused mental health problems, etc. And those are all legitimate perspectives. So the people who ran the inquiry, people in whom I have an awful lot of faith, raise the issue of public trust. Now, it's important to recognise this isn't a binary thing. It's not as though people do or do not trust government, but it's the extent to which they do and on what issue and on what day is the truth. And there's no doubt that there's evidence of some diminution in trust of government in some people. But on the other side of the coin, and I've been talking about this a lot over the last 24 hours, there are very clearly locational differences. Folks in Western Australia were very clear in saying they shut the borders, they thought it was a great move, they felt very safe as a result, they would support that happening again tomorrow if necessary. And people in Victoria, for example, who experienced the long periods of shutdown and frequent periods of shutdown, obviously brought a different perspective to that. But there is constant response across all places I've been talking about this, that people appreciated that the priority was public safety and health. And the truth is thousands, maybe tens of thousands of lives were saved. That is, people didn't die as a result of exposure to this virus, particularly in the early stages of the pandemic where there was no vaccine available, where there was no clarity as to the best way of treating people with the virus, and particularly vulnerable people. So the issue of trust is an ongoing challenge for governments on all issues, and the report certainly highlighted that as one of the challenges, particularly in the context of if we have to face a pandemic or a threat of this kind in the future. So it's a consideration. It's not the only consideration, and it's not 100% in any direction, but it's something we always have to be conscious of.
Something the inquiry highlighted was a lack of consideration, or questions, I suppose, about the consideration of our human rights when these more punitive restrictions and rules were being enforced. What is the relationship between how we feel about our human rights and how we feel about our politicians?
Well, now there's a philosophical question. There's a whole range of challenges amongst all of that. And ultimately, democracy is about how we choose to be governed, in understanding that there is a need for government, and government play a whole bunch of fundamentally important roles, collectively resourcing things to benefit us in a collective manner. But there has to be constraints with that, and all governments, all politicians have to strike the balance, and if they get that balance wrong, they face the electorate at the next election. And so when it came to these difficult choices, when there was an enormous threat and a genuine health threat, governments had to try and get that balance right. A lot of people think they did, and this report showed that broadly Australia did pretty well in the context of the pandemic. But there's no doubt there are stains on the souls of many people, and there's long-term effects from a mental health point of view, from an educational point of view, of some of the constraints that happened. And the report very much invites people who are thinking about preparing for any such similar event in the future to figure out how they're going to take those kind of adverse consequences into account when making those decisions in the future. And the biggest challenge here, the biggest issue here in this report, is not about finding blame for who did what wrong, but rather what lessons we can learn so we can be better next time. And I think that's exactly the right approach that should be taken by both the report and governments, both at a national and a state and territory level.
And I think one of the lessons was the inquiry highlighted that a lot of people felt that the decisions being made by the government were not being, A, communicated clearly enough, but B, the reason behind the decision to bring in a rule like shutting a border or enforcing a lockdown was not being explained enough. I guess my feeling is the reason that didn't happen is almost because the reasons didn't exist and governments were being forced to act on the fly. How can governments learn from those potential lessons in the future?
Yeah, and to an extent, that's the kind of response about the establishment of an Australian Centre for Disease Control that has a responsibility. Now, there's a turn of phrase used that I've heard many times during the pandemic and since, and that was that we were building the plane as we were flying it. And that was, in effect, the kind of challenge when it came to making those decisions. The decisions had to be made on the best available information on that day as to what serious constraints were going to be applied to the population and how they might be implemented. The challenge for the CDC is to build the plane before it takes off next time. That's ultimately what it should do, and learn from the experiences of the last flight, figure out where we went in the wrong turns, where the service wasn't good, et cetera, et cetera. I mean, if you want to continue that analogy. But ultimately, the CDC has to be about making sure the best possible expertise is available. The connections internationally and internally are in place so that jurisdictions can effectively and rapidly and in real time talk to each other about their experiences and what they're learning. We can learn from what's going on overseas. We can learn about what the nature of the threat is from a scientific point of view, from a health point of view, what the impact might be on the health system, and what are the effective ways of constraining that. So ultimately, all of those things need to be brought together, and that's best done by a highly expert, properly resourced agency, and the Centre for Disease Control is what the government's proposed to do that. But I'd also emphasise that there's a really important responsibility for the states and territories. But it's also very much highlighted in the report that the states and territories where that public health power lies, where Queensland makes a decision that's separate from New South Wales and it might affect transition across that border, etc., that while the federal government has now committed $250 million over 4 years for the Centre for Disease Control, what I'm concerned about is I haven't seen or heard of any state or territory making a similar kind of commitment in terms of boosting its public health capacity since the pandemic has occurred. And if this is genuinely going to work and we genuinely accept the importance of the role of both federal level entities like the CDC and states and territories, where's the states and territories' money to ante up and make sure they boost their game when it comes to public health preparedness, response and capacity to deal with the challenges of what might come around the corner by way of a future pandemic, but also those chronic diseases that are with us all the time, the things that our families experience and, cause enormous adverse health effects, heartache, loss of life. Cardiovascular disease, cancer, diabetes, dementia, the things that are chronic diseases that do cost lives, that are in large part preventable, and how the CDC can play an active role and the states and territories can play a more active role in what we can do to prevent those, as well as being ready for those infectious disease threats.
Before we let you go, we were talking especially initially about public trust and how that was damaged by the COVID pandemic and Australia's response to it, especially, maybe post-2020, maybe as we entered into 2021. Do you think we can repair what has been lost when it comes to public trust, both in science and in government?
I think there's a really important step to be made through the establishment of an independent CDC. The proposal is to have this entity like the Therapeutic Goods Administration although the head of the CDC will report directly to the Health Minister and report annually to the Parliament, that direct level of responsibility and accountability and building in the expectation of the kind of expertise that we hope the CDC will develop and improve its capacity to effectively communicate the evidence that it has and the recommendations that it makes directly to the punters, the voters, the people who are going to be affected by these things. That's about putting in the best possible accountability process, which I hope will build the kind of trust that we're talking about. Ultimately, there's always going to be people who are going to be conspiracy theorists and are going to rail against government influence, recommendations, controls. That's never going away. But we can and should make our best efforts to be clear, transparent and open when it comes to the recommendations we make on health, as it should be with every other part of public policy.
Adjunct Professor Terry Slevin from the Public Health Association of Australia speaking with me there. And that is it for this episode of The Briefing. We would love it if you could share it with someone you think might enjoy it. And also don't forget to check out our other content. We put up heaps on Instagram. We're at The Briefing Podcast. We're also on TikTok and YouTube. Search Listener Newsroom. We'll be back in your feed tomorrow morning at 6 with more headlines and another deep dive. I'm Sacha Barbour Gatt. Catch you next time.